Hello, everybody. Today I've decided to do a podcast on ethics. Now, this is a topic that actually is something I consider very important. I've taught a few college courses on science ethics, so it's a topic I do know something about. I also studied ethics a bit when I was an undergraduate in college as well. And the reason I like this field so much is because I think that studying it and evaluating ethical decision making is actually a good way for us to know ourselves better and to know each other better. And I do think that that's pretty important for us to more honestly and fairly evaluate ourselves and each other um, in terms of what we believe is right and wrong. So, for those of you who don't know what ethics means, and there may be a lot of you, that's okay. First time I took ethics course, I didn't know what it meant. Ethics is simply the study of how humans make decisions about right and wrong. That is, um, when we're faced with a decision where we have a choice between doing something that we or others might consider a right thing versus not such a right thing or a wrong thing. How do we make that decision? And of course, this varies from individual to individual. Different people make these decisions differently using different priorities. But I think it's always good to look at how you prioritize your ethical decision making and then take a look at how other people, maybe people in your life, people who are important to you, or politicians you might be voting for, whatever, how they make ethical decisions. What kind of decisions do they make when faced with choices between things that may be righter and wronger? Now, humans tend to have an innate sense of right and wrong. That is, we grow up thinking that, this is the right thing to do and this is the wrong thing to do. We don't always follow our innate sense. Sometimes we make decisions deliberately that, we involve things that we know are wrong. Maybe we do that to achieve a higher good, a better right, or maybe we just want to do it. But in any case, I think it's useful to look at our ethical frameworks and to see how we make those decisions, to gain insight into ourselves and into each other. And also, I happen to think this is a neglected field. I think looking at right and wrong, things to do, and why we consider them right or wrong, is important. Not just in our day-to-day lives, but just important for our development as human beings in the social world. So, going to start in on this, and I may get a little bit deep in the weeds here, but because I'm a teacher and I'm used to teaching this as a class, I'm not going to try to turn this podcast into a class. But I do want to talk a little technically here about the three major, what they call dimensions or spheres of ethical decision making. And throughout history, there have been philosophers and theologians, religious folks who have thought deeply about, how do we decide issues of right and wrong, and how should we? And can divide up sort of the way they look at these things into three different domains or dimensions, which is the classical dimension, looking at what you intend to do, what your action is, what your intention was when you did that action. So what the action is, what did you do, why did you do it, that's your intention, and then the results, how did it turn out? And in the classical ethics, the classical ethical philosophers looked at those three dimensions, the action, the intention, and the result, and different philosophers came down on different sides about which of those was most important when making an ethical decision, which mattered most. And we'll be talking a little about that. And then later on, they started talking about ethical principles, um, which are just sort of, you can think of them as like more moral imperatives, aspects of morality that we consider high on our list. And ethical principles can include things like equity and fairness. They can include things like freedom and liberty. Um, they can include minimizing harm or maximizing pleasure or happiness. They're just flip sides of the same coin, really. Protecting and caring for others, again, sort of the same coin. Loyalty, standing by others. Honesty, being truthful. Obedience, obeying authority. Um, and then people subscribe to different faiths, different religious faiths, which have different tenets. There are different, prescriptions like the Ten Commandments, what is okay and not okay to do. And so if you have religious faith as a deep ethical principle, then you would tend to follow whatever the divine law is in your faith. So, for example, in a Judeo-Christian faith, following the rules of the Ten Commandments might be very important to you if your faith is a high ethical principle for you. And then there's also community traditions. How important is it to you to follow the cultural traditions of your community? To do what's expected of you by your culture. So all of these are ethical principles, and of course different people are going to weigh different principles differently. Like, for example, somebody who volunteers for military service. In military service, there are high ethics of obedience is a fairly high ethic. Also, protecting and caring for others is a very high ethic. Also, freedom and liberty, particularly protecting and preserving that for others. So those are high ethics in military service, typically. We fought a revolutionary war on a primary ethic of freedom and liberty from what we saw as what folks back then saw as the tyranny of imperial rule, the rule of a king, right? And then we fought a civil war over the idea of freedom and liberty for folks with dark skin, freedom from slavery, liberty from slavery. So we have fought wars over some of these ethical principles, including some super important wars in American history. Now, another thing to consider when you're looking, another dimension of ethics is not just the principles and the actions involved, but the individuals who will be affected by what you do. And, who is it primarily you're doing this for? For yourself, for your family, for your friends, for your community, which can be defined a bunch of different ways, for your country. Again, for military service, country is often the ethical sphere. For the world, and if you have maybe a more ecological perspective, for the world could include not just human life, but non-human life as well. So you're doing this for animals or for plants. Now in community, the only thing that really needs clarification for the sphere here is in communities can be defined a lot of different ways. Humans form lots of different communal groups. Religious community is one. So for example, following the tenets of your faith you might be thinking primarily of doing right by your religious community. But there's also regional communities like the neighborhood you live in or the town you live in, for example. There's social communities, whatever your social group happens to be, although that may overlap with friends here. There's your political party, which in our country right now is a pretty uh, hard-nosed community that people adhere to with a lot of loyalty. A lot of loyalty. So, for example, in politics, you may value loyalty above all. You may decide that you're going to vote for whoever uh, is the representative of your party, even if you don't agree with them about a lot of things, just because that's being a loyal party member. So, again, there's these three dimensions or three spheres of ethics. There's just looking specifically when you're making an ethical decision at the action you have to do, the reason you're doing it, and how it turns out. That's sort of classical ethics. The original ethical philosophers really focused up here. Then there's principles involved, sort of moral tenets that are involved in your ethical decision making, and then the sphere of influence of your ethical decisions. Who's really being affected, who's intended to be affected. And where we really get into the weeds here and into difficulties with ethics, the reason why ethical decisions aren't all easy is, of course, we all tend to prioritize different aspects within each of these dimensions differently. For example, for some people in the classical dimension, the intention is more important than the outcome. And for other people, the outcome is much more important than the intention. You may have intended something not so good, but if it turned out well, you did a good thing. You may have intended something good, and if it turned out badly, you did a bad thing if you consider the outcome the most important thing. If you consider the intention the most important thing, then you did a good thing. You were ethical. So there's the principles and there's the individuals affected. But within each of these domains, there are conflicts, right? So just like we said, you can have good intentions with a bad outcome, or bad intentions with a good outcome. You can also have situations where your principles are in conflict. For example, if you have loyalty to, say, your friends or your family as a very high principle, but there are situations where your loyalty to a friend may require you to be dishonest. So if loyalty and honesty are both high principles for you, you may be put in a situation in life or find yourself in a situation where you have to actually choose between them. You can't do both. For example, let's say I have a friend who I know, because they told me, has done something illegal and bad. And my friend gets arrested for what they did. And then I get questioned because the police are just questioning folks who knew this person about what they did. Now, to remain loyal to my friend, the way I view loyalty, I may have to be dishonest with the police. Say, I don't know anything about what happened, even though I do. So there's a lot of situations where our principles can be in conflict. For example, the principle of loyalty can be in conflict with the principle of honesty. The principles, of course, of freedom can be in conflict with the principle of obedience, depending on where you place those ethics. Most of us, I think, place freedom over obedience, but in other cultures, not necessarily like that. There's a number of cultures around the world, including some Asian cultures, where obedience is like a very high top ethic. And so you will sacrifice, people will routinely and gladly sacrifice a lot of their freedom and liberty for the high ethic of obedience, to be obedient to whatever the authorities are. And of course, there are conflicts within the sphere of who's affected by your ethical decisions. For example, there's something I may want to do personally, but I may know that it won't have such a good effect on my family if I do it. But it will have some positive benefit to me. So in that case, I'm forced to choose between doing something good for me versus doing something good for my family. So there's conflict within the sphere of affected people. Which people are affected? Some might be affected well, some poorly. So within each of these domains, we frequently face ethical decisions where there's a conflict between different aspects of the domain, different principles, different individuals, intentions versus outcomes. And that's where we get into sticky ethical territory. It's like, okay, when there's a pretty obvious conflict between the benefits of an ethical decision, what do we choose to do? Now, first of all, I want to make some things clear. Not every decision that you make every day, we make thousands of decisions every day. Not every decision you make every day is an ethical decision. For example, the decision to have one kind of sandwich or another kind of sandwich for lunch, not an ethical decision. Decision to take this route to work versus that route to work, not an ethical decision most likely. It's probably based on where you can get fastest or cheapest or where traffic is least. Decision for me to wear this shirt versus another shirt this morning, not an ethical decision. Okay, not every decision you make has a moral or ethical component to it where there's a right and a wrong involved. A lot of these things are just choices of convenience or necessity, or just preference. So don't think for a second that ethics is involved in every choice you make. It isn't. But I think at least a few times a week, most of us are involved or are required to actually make an ethical choice. For example, the choice to lie about something we've done or not lie about it. When we're confronted by someone else with something that we'd kind of rather not talk about or rather not admit to. That's one example of where you actually do have an ethical decision making. When you have a choice to violate a principle or to help versus harm individuals, or where your intentions may not match up with how things turn out. These, are more in the realm of ethics. So I think at least a few times a week, all of us are called upon to make decisions like that, where there's a real right and wrong, a real moral or ethical dimension to the decision. Okay, so how do we go about making ethical decisions? Well, to be honest, most of us just sort of do it automatically. It's not like we do like a big ethical analysis whenever we're called upon to make an ethical decision. Like if somebody confronts us with something we'd rather not admit to, we don't sit there and say, well, give me 15 minutes while I go through an ethical analysis of this to see which way might be better, which principle I hold higher and all that. Most of us just sort of do this almost automatically. And so you think, well, if this is sort of an automatic brain process, how is it that we can know what our true ethical principles and priorities are here? And the answer to that actually is really simple. Look at the decisions you've made, not the ones you may have to make later, the ones you've already made. When you were given a choice, like when somebody confronted you with something you were uncomfortable admitting, what did you do? Did you admit to it? Did you not admit to it? And if you didn't admit to it, why didn't you admit to it? What was your intention? Who were you thinking of mostly here? Okay, and if you go through a lot of your ethical decisions, if you make it a routine to sort of look backwards at the ethical decisions you did have to make recently and see where you came down most of the time, which of these principles did you adhere to, which did you not, which people did you prioritize, which of these things, the action, the intention, the outcome, did you prioritize as far as you're feeling okay about the decision you made. That tells you what your ethics are, looking back over a number of your decisions. You can't just look at one decision. There are different circumstances for different decision, and some of them may cause you to switch, which principle you hold higher. Um, for example, if all I have to do is to get out of an uncomfortable situation is tell a little lie, a little fib, which doesn't seem like it's going to cause great harm, then the choice to not tell the truth in that case doesn't mean I'm always dishonest. It just may mean in that low stakes case, that's the choice I made. Honesty was not, when the stakes aren't too high, honesty was not one of my high principles. But in a situation where there's much more at stake, or in a situation where you would have to be more than dishonest, you would have to actually actively harm someone to get out of a bad situation, then what choice do you make? So if somebody discovers something I've been doing bad, and they don't buy my dishonesty, I won't admit to it, but they don't buy it, then if I then make the choice to, kill them in order to preserve my secret, then, yeah, that tells me something about where my ethics are, or whether I have any at all. So that actually brings us back a little bit to classical ethics here, where you look at the action that you had to do, whatever it is you actually had to actively do in your decision making. Now, what you actively did may have been to tell a lie, or what you actively did may have been to help somebody, or what you actively did may have been to hit somebody over the head with a hammer. Those were the actions. What were your intentions? Okay, what were you trying to accomplish by doing what you did? Why'd you do it? And then how did it turn out? So there are different sort of classical ethical philosophers who prioritize these three things differently in classical ethics. For example, Immanuel Kant, who's one of the great classical philosophers from the 1600s, he actually believed that people should, when they make ethical decisions, always prioritize an action and an intention over an outcome. He didn't believe humans were very good at predicting outcomes of their actions, so he didn't think that was a good way to prioritize, something as far as whether it was ethical or not, because the outcome of what we do is not always predictable by us. And he's no doubt right about that. So, he believed that we should stick to the sphere of things that are in our control, mentally and physically, when we make ethical decisions, and those are the actions and the intentions. And Kant believed that an action, he had a way of determining whether an action was a good action or a bad action. For example, whether hitting somebody over the head with a hammer was a good thing or a bad thing, regardless of why you did it. And he, one of the ways that he believed we should judge whether an action was good or bad is what society and what human society would be like if everybody felt free to do that action. Let's suppose there were no ethical or moral constraints, and so everybody just does that action when they want to. Does society become better or worse? That is, more ordered and sustainable, or more chaotic and crazy and unsustainable? So you can think of, hitting somebody over the head with a hammer, the way Kant would view that as well. If everybody felt that way, we wouldn't even have a society. We just have this brutal anarchy. So that action, regardless of why you did it, is bad. It is unethical. And even if your intentions were good, still an unethical act. Like, suppose my intention there wasn't to protect myself. Suppose my intention in hitting somebody with a hammer was to protect someone else. Suppose that person was attacking somebody else. Okay, so my intention actually was to save another person in that case. And the outcome is I hit this bad person with the head with the hammer, so they weren't able to hurt the good person, and so the outcome was good too. But still, even in that situation, Kant would have trouble with your action, because that action would, if it were universally followed, would cause societal chaos. So, get into some sticky stuff here. Now, there's a whole other group of moral philosophers like John Stuart Mill, who was very influential in the writing of the U.S. Constitution, and Jeremy Bentham. Not that Stuart Mill actually wrote the Constitution, but he influenced the people who did. Almost everyone who was heavily involved with writing the Constitution read John Stuart Mill. And he was a moral philosopher in the 1700s, and a student, actually, of Jeremy Bentham. And these folks were what are called utilitarians or consequentialists, in that they believed that of these three things, the outcome of an action, how things actually turned out, is more important than what the action was or what your intention was when you did it. Maybe you did something bad, and maybe you actually had lousy reasons for doing it, but if it happened to turn out that it made life better for lots of people, then it was a good thing to do, and it was ethical. So one way that Stuart Mill's ideas sort of appear in the U.S. Constitution is in the very beginning of the U.S. Constitution, which is, we hold these rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. See, that third one is interesting. Life, liberty, okay, life, liberty, liberty's on here. And the pursuit of happiness, also on here, maximizing pleasure or happiness. But the pursuit of happiness is actually a very utilitarian idea. These folks, because they really believed in, something was a good choice if it led to good outcomes, how did they define good outcomes? Mostly by maximizing the pleasure and happiness of the most people. So they coined the phrase "the most good for the most people," and they defined good as usually minimizing harm and maximizing pleasure and happiness for the most individuals. So pursuit of happiness is like almost a verbatim steal from philosophies of Mill and Bentham. And they actually were they were proponents of the idea of the ends justify the means. If things turn out good for the most people, then it was good to do it, even if it didn't turn out good for everybody. By the way, when we fight wars, we're doing something that probably Kant would have considered bad just a priori, just on its face, because wars involve killing and also invariably lead to the killing of innocents, and those actions are bad. And if they were universally done, society would dissolve. So from a Kantian perspective, war is never a good thing. But from a utilitarian perspective, war can be a good thing if the outcome of the war means more freedom, more fairness, better world for most people. So, for example, World War II was a horrific and bloody war. Bloodiest war that's ever been fought, with casualties in the tens of millions. It was a terrible, terrible war, just from a human misery and casualty perspective. And of course, as in all wars, lots of innocent people died in that war. Just in the bombing of Dresden and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just in those three events, we probably killed, 300,000 or more innocent civilians. Uh, so from an actions perspective, war is pretty much never good. It involves killing, including the inadvertent, usually killing of innocents. Just unleashing the worst of human instinct on the world and the most destructive human powers on the world. So the actions of war are usually horrific. The intentions, depending on whose side you're on and what you believe, may be good or bad. In the case of World War II, the intentions of Hitler to make the world safe for the Aryan race and pretty much miserable death and slave pit for everyone else was probably not very good intention. Although you could argue on the other side that the intentions of the Allied powers, for example, the United States, was to stop that from happening and to stop the slaughter that the Nazis were perpetrating against other groups. So our intention was not only to protect ourselves, but also to protect others from this sort of vile ideology. So our intentions may have been good there. And the outcome ultimately was fairly positive for us. We defeated Germany, defeated Japan, we defeated Italy, with help from the British and the Free French and the Russians. So it wasn't just us. But the outcome was Nazism was defeated, fascism was defeated, Japanese imperialism and colonialism was defeated. The world became a safer place to the extent of, fewer of these big-time global conflicts. And so you can look at it as a positive outcome with good intentions on our side, but the actions we had to do to get there, or the actions we actually chose to do to get there, were various degrees of horrific. Now, most people these days, particularly here in the U.S., feel that was we did good there. And so based on that feeling that most people have, you can say that most people actually ethically prioritize outcomes and intentions over actions. We had good intentions, the outcome was good, therefore, okay, yeah, we had to do some bad stuff to get there, but it's okay because it turned out okay. And I think that's where a lot of people in the United States come down. So if we're honest with ourselves, most of us are ends justify the means kind of people. Even though we might not think of ourselves that way, we are. We really believe that the ends justify the means, and we're willing to accept some icky means in order to get to some positive ends. That is, we're willing to accept ourselves and others doing pretty bad stuff in order to get to somewhere better. You can kind of tell that in our action movies too. I mean, the movies that we like and the action, the characters we idolize, there are a lot of people who do bad stuff to get to better places, with good intentions to get to better places. That's, and even in our politicians, we tend to accept a lot of bad actions among our politicians, particularly on the Republican side, if we believe that their intentions are good or that they're trying to get us to a better place, trying to help us out. So as a culture, the American culture, U.S. culture, very much a John Stuart Mill culture, who informed the writing of our Constitution. Very much the ends do justify the means. So you can do some pretty terrible stuff as long as it gets folks to a better place. And we're okay with that. Now, not every culture is like that. There are a lot of other cultures that are more Kantian, that are more, they really pay much more attention to whether the actions themselves that we're doing to get to where we are acceptable actions. And if they aren't, then That's not ethical even if things end up turning out okay. So again, this is why I like to do ethical analysis, because it gives us, I think, deep insight into ourselves and into others. And that's pretty much what I got to say about this. So I do recommend that, next time you're faced with an ethical decision, don't try to do this before you make the decision, because you'll be sitting there meditating for hours. But after you've made an ethical decision, take a look back, see what you prioritized to make the decision you made. Why'd you make it? What did you prioritize up here? The outcomes, your intentions. What did you prioritize down here? Which of these principles was most important when you made that decision? And you can tell based on the decision. And then who was most important in your thinking? Did you do it for your friends? Did you do it for your family? Did you do it for yourself? And again, I think you'll gain, if you do that on a fairly regular basis with yourself, with others, you'll gain good insight into how it is that humans, and you in particular, really do make ethical decisions, and which of these aspects of each domain do you prioritize when you make these decisions. Okay, so that's what I got for you today, and thanks for joining me.